In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Have you ever been to one of those dinners? A dinner where there are assigned places and where the tables and seating arrangement make it very clear who is important? It might be at a business meeting or convention where the connection to power is what's at the front of people's minds. Or it might be at a fundraising gala where the wealthy are seated toward the front and in the center. One of my friends, now retired, tells stories of the way seating was carefully managed at elegant luncheons given by his firm for a large group of business affiliates. Each table had a member of the management team, and some of the business affiliates would come in early and move name cards around if they didn't like their seats, if they weren't close enough to power. Today's gospel reading is, like last week's, a story about Jesus on a Sabbath. Last week, he was teaching in the synagogue and healed a bent-over woman, which did not go over well with the synagogue leader. In today's reading, Jesus is at the home of a leader of the Pharisees for a meal. So who were the Pharisees? When we hear about Pharisees, we usually associate them with the bad guys. We think of them as the ones who were against Jesus or always testing him. But that doesn't quite fit with the idea of Jesus going to the home of a leader of the Pharisees for a meal. The Pharisees were devout Jews who carefully studied and followed religious law, the Torah, what we know as the first 5 books of the Old Testament. They followed all 613 of the holiness and purity laws and believed that these laws, rules and behaviors, if you will, were the core of what every good Jew should be doing. They thought that all Jews should follow all of those purity laws all the time, not just the priests, and not just those going to Jerusalem for some purification ritual. So why would Jesus go to a meal at the home of not just a Pharisee, but one of the leaders of the Pharisees? In the first century, in both the Roman Empire and the culture of the Jews, meals were ceremonies. A meal like this was a major production where relationships, roles, and statuses were both displayed and affirmed. Eating together implied shared values, similar ideas, and a comparable social position. This meal would have been for Jewish men, as a leader of the Pharisees wouldn't eat with Gentiles. And the worlds of men and women were kept very, very separate. And like major banquets today, the seating would have indicated social power and position, proximity to those who were socially prominent and powerful, conveyed status and honor. So why would a Pharisee invite Jesus to a social occasion like this? The beginning of the passage tells us the Pharisees were watching Jesus closely. It might mean that they were watching him at that time, that day. But it also might mean that they were watching him more generally. After all, he's been healing people, even if they don't necessarily approve of him healing on the Sabbath. And he's clearly a knowledgeable rabbi. From their perspective, he bears watching. Jesus, having accepted the invitation, was watching the people around him as well. Of course, the guests were trying to choose places of honor. their position and status would be enhanced in the eyes of all those present if they were sitting in the places of honor, or if they were seated near the host. Jesus noticed them jockeying for proximity to power and honor. And once again, Jesus turns the social order upside down in his directions to the people at this Sabbath meal at the home of a Pharisee. He tells them not to take the place of honor, so they are not shamed if the place is intended for someone else. Now, that's no surprise. It's good advice. The logical thing would be to take a place in the middle. But that's not what Jesus tells them. He tells them to take the lowest place, not something in the middle, but the lowest place. So they will be honored when the host offers them a higher place at the table. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. That's the antithesis of culture. Now and then. And it was nothing new in the time of Jesus. The reading from Jeremiah, which reminds me of the passages from Isaiah 2 weeks ago, and from Amos earlier this summer, is full of accusations against the people who have broken the covenant, followed other gods, false gods, and traded their relationship with God for worthless things. Those false gods, the false gods of their time, were Baal, the fertility god, and the other idols of that time. But they aren't the only ones. The false gods of today, possessions, food, alcohol, pleasure, fame, money, power. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. I wonder how the guests at that meal reacted. Then Jesus turns the tables on his host as well, telling him not to invite his friends and brothers, those of similar wealth and status, who would return the invitation later. Instead, Jesus says that the ones to invite are those on the margins, those of lower status, those who cannot return the invitation, who are outside the bounds of the society. Jesus says to invite those who the Pharisee would normally not associate with at all. That's as much the antithesis of culture then and now as the instructions to the guests. Jesus tells him to reach out, to make a place of honor for those who are not honored, and that he'll be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous, at God's banquet. That's radical hospitality, inviting and sharing with those who are truly on the margins. It's like cooking and serving at the peace meal. It's like hosting and helping at the Episcopal City Mission monthly birthday parties for those in juvenile detention. It's like serving at the Trinity Hot Lunch program or at one of the many food pantries throughout the city. That radical hospitality is right in line with the teaching of the Torah, something the Pharisee would have known, the requirement to care for the widows, the orphans, and the resident aliens in your midst. Essentially, those who have no way to care for themselves. Perhaps this little parable felt more than a little pointed to the Pharisees. And the author of the Hebrews also stresses this care for others, particularly those in need or trouble. Let mutual love continue, with the reminder to show hospitality to strangers, not unlike inviting the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind to a banquet. Mutual love, a life of service, of caring for others first, of caring for those in danger, is the sharing of honor rather than the hoarding of position and authority. And that author, not Paul, but we don't know who, the Greek is too good to be Paul, that author reminds us to be content with what we have and to share what we have. So what if this is how God intends for us to live? What if what God intends for us is to serve humbly, to choose the place of least honor, to make sure that those on the margins are not just taken care of, but included at God's table? What if God intends us to live in ways that turn the culture upside down? What if, as best we can, we're called to practice hospitality to strangers, treating all as if they might be the angels that some have entertained unaware? What if God intends us to practice God's hospitality, the divine hospitality that knows no limits and excludes no one? For all are welcome at God's table. Amen.